Hello! It's been quite a while since I last did something like this, and it's actually the first time I've done it with CTR Nitro Fueled. The main reason why I stopped talking about the technical, behind the scenes stuff with modding these games is because whenever I do, I always learn more about how everything works later on. And I realised that most of what I said was wrong or irrelevant, and actually that will probably be even more true with this game than it has been with the Insane Trilogy, because there probably won't be much interest in modding this game until it comes to PC, if that ever happens. And if that does happen, then it's not going to work exactly in the way that I'm about to talk about. But a lot of people have been asking me about this kind of thing every day since the game came out, and I'm not exactly going out very much at the moment, so I thought I'd take some time to try to explain how these kind of mods work and what it is and isn't possible to do, so that people might finally stop asking me to add their favourite obscure Spyro characters to the game. So the first question a lot of people have when they see stuff like this is, how is it even possible to mod CTR Nitro Fueled when it hasn't been released on PC? The answer is, this is the Nintendo Switch version of the game, which is a bit of a significant graphical downgrade to the PS4 version, but as far as I'm aware, it's the only version that it's actually currently possible to mod, or even access the files of. I'm not going to go into any detail about how or why it's possible to mod Switch games, because there's plenty of information about that kind of stuff already on the internet. But if you don't currently own a Switch and you're interested in getting into Switch modding, make sure you do some research first and stock up on paper clips. So it is a shame that the only version of the game we can mess with at the moment is the most limited version, but the good news, for me at least, is that CTR Nitro Fueled uses the same engine as the Insane Trilogy. Even though Vicarious Visions wasn't the main developer for CTR, the game still uses their Alchemy engine, which they actually first used way back in the OG Crash Nitro Kart. It's also been used for a few Skylanders games, and actually, once you start digging into the files, it becomes pretty clear that Skylanders Imaginators was used as the basis for the Insane Trilogy, which in turn was used as the basis for CTR Nitro Fueled. They're all just kind of built on top of each other. And if you open up the files for CTR, you'll see something that looks very similar to the Insane Trilogy. This is actually the PC version of the Insane Trilogy, because the Switch version does things a bit differently when it comes to the playable characters, and it would just overcomplicate everything so much more if I tried to explain that. Apart from that, the two versions are mostly the same. With both games, we have this archives folder, inside of which are a lot of pack files that contain most of the game data. Now, scrolling through all of these files, it's fairly self-explanatory what most of them are. There's some character stuff here, which I'll be delving into in a minute, and there's some tracks down here, but not all of them. These files only cover the content from the base game, so the tracks end at Hyperspaceway, and most of the characters and skins and stuff are missing, even though this is the latest version of the game. The reason for that is that every single file that's been added or updated through a patch is buried in either update.pack or updatehub.pack. For some reason, files related to the adventure mode map have their own update archive. I don't know why, but everything else is in this huge update.pack file. And this file is the reason why every game update is bigger than the last. Even when the only thing it does is change the trophy on the startup screen, every time you update the game, you're downloading the latest version of this massive file. And before you ask, this thing that I'm using to open up the archives is a little program that I wrote back when Nitro Fueled came out, because none of the old modding tools for the Insane Trilogy worked with Nitro Fueled, so I just made my own that did. I actually never ended up releasing this because a lot of what it does is done much better by the level editor that I'm working on, which will be released at some point. But if the old stuff still doesn't work with CTR, I don't actually know because I haven't used it myself for a long time. But if anyone needs something that does work with CTR files, then at some point I could probably fix this up a bit to be a bit less horrible and release it. But anyway, these update archives are special for a few reasons. For one, they contain other archive files in this install directory, and this is where most of the missing content is. Here are all the characters and skins that weren't in the base game. Here are the carts, and here are the tracks. And then inside the temporary folder, things look a little bit more like they do in the other archives. All of these are either files that were in the base game and have been modified, or they're additional files that are sort of being injected into those original files. So, for example, there's files in here for the ring rally mode of every track. Those don't exist in the base archives, so the game loads them in from here instead. The way that it works is that every file that's contained in any of these archives has its own ID number, which is unique to that specific file, but the same ID number is used for all copies of that file, even if there's a modified version in update.pack. So if you take this Crash Cove art file in the update archive, its ID is 604683761. And back in the original Crash Cove archive, that same file's ID is 604683761. Even though the content of those files is different, they have the same ID. And what happens is when the game loads all the files it needs to play Crash Cove, it checks to see if any of those files exist in update.pack. And if they do, it will load that updated version of the file instead of the original. If you were to remove that file or change its ID within the code of update.pack, the game would no longer see that updated file and would just load the original. Because it's the same engine, you can actually do the same thing with the Insane Trilogy. That game will also check for a file called update.pack and load stuff from inside it instead of the original archives if it's present. That's how my level editor works now, so when you make custom levels, the original files never get modified at all, and resetting the game back to vanilla is as simple as deleting update.pack. So my knowledge of the Insane Trilogy has made modding CTR very easy, but modding this game has also taught me some interesting tricks that work in the Insane Trilogy as well, which is pretty handy. But even though CTR Nitro Fueled and the Insane Trilogy are structured in a very similar way, there are some significant differences, most notably in the way that playable characters work. Obviously, for one, there are a lot more playable characters in CTR, even when you take into account the unused extra characters in the NST that I've talked about before. But I'm talking more about how they're organised. So in the NST, there's one pack file for each character. Crash.pack, Coco.pack, those are the main ones, obviously. And inside each of those archives is everything the game needs to load that character. So, for example, here's Coco's model and the skeleton version that appears when she's electrocuted. There's more stuff down here like her laptop and her phone. We've got all her animations, her sound effects, her textures, everything, all in one archive. But if you open up drivercoco.pack in the CTR files, which you'd expect to be that game's equivalent, not everything is here. There's animations and sound effects, but no models, and if you look inside the textures folder, it's just a couple of icons. So where's everything else? Well, that depends on which skin you're using. The NST does include alternative skins for Crash and Coco, but unless you mod the game, they're only used in certain levels, and you can't just swap between them willy-nilly like you can in CTR. So those alternative skins are just stored inside the archives of the levels that they're used in. With CTR, extra skins means extra archives. The model for Coco's default skin, as she appears in the NST, is in the default skins archive, or default cutscene skins, for a slightly higher level of detail model. That's the one used on the podium. And her textures, which are shared by both of those versions, are in the default materials archive. These alt materials files are the textures for her exotic skins, which are the recolors, and these Star and Nitro Fueled archives are all the files used for her legendary skins that were in the base game. All her other skins that were added later on are inside update.pack somewhere, as are everyone else's. And all of this fragmentation, combined with the fact that I don't think it's possible to run this game on the Switch with extracted files, like you can with the PC version of the NST, that all means that even though the concept behind custom characters is the same as the things I've talked about when I've done it with the NST. In practice, there's a few more steps involved. However, CTR does have one major advantage over the NST when it comes to swapping character models around. The reason why Papu Papu was the only boss character I really did this with properly in the Insane Trilogy is that out of all the boss characters, only him and Embryo's monster form have proper movement animations. In CTR Nitro Fueled, you never walk around on foot. When you're controlling your character, they're always driving a cart, so that problem is no longer a problem in this game. All the physical movement is controlled by the cart. But you still can't just swap in any character you want. There's a specific reason why I've been able to do it with characters like the Hog and a giant polar bear, and not like the tribesmen or those mafia guys in the sewers or the massive dragon from the Wrath of Cortex, as much as I wish I could do that. And that reason is these HKX files in the character assets folders of every playable character. They're referred to as asset behavior files, and I still don't know exactly what they do. The files with extensions beginning in HK are all related to Havoc. They're not nice alchemy files that I know how to read. But since Nitro Fueled came out, there have been some developments with some of the other Havoc files, like the animations. There are now tools for exporting those, so maybe in the future someone will figure this stuff out, but for now you can only play as characters you're not supposed to be able to play as, and have them animate without looking like this if they have their own asset behavior file. The only exception is if you're using a character that doesn't actually need to animate in the first place. And most of the non-playable characters in these games, the enemies, the background characters, etc., do not have these files. They're mostly either just standing in one spot and repeating an action, or they're moving back and forward along a set path. It's the characters that have a bit more going on that tend to have these behavior files. In the case of the Insane Trilogy, that's generally the characters that you ride on, and enemies that chase you through a level, and the boss characters whose attack patterns are a bit more complex than standard enemies. In CTR, it's basically only the characters that are already playable that have these files, as well as the carts, but I'll get to that later. The other characters scattered around the racetracks, even the ones that you can interact with, like the plants in Papu's Pyramid, do not have any of the behavior files that you need to make this work. The reason why it's possible to make characters like the Hog playable in CTR is because they have the necessary behavior files in the NST, where they're more than just background cameos. The behavior files and all the animation files are cross-compatible between the two games, and that means you can use CTR animations in the NST as well. And even actually animations from Skylanders Imaginators work in the Crash games, but good luck getting them to look good with the non-Skylanders models, because the format of the models is slightly different between the games. Not much, but enough to make them incompatible. I am 99% confident that it's possible to fix that, and at the very least make CTR models backwards compatible with the Insane Trilogy, even if we can't go the other way. But it's something that I haven't spent much time trying to do yet. But the upshot of all of this is that the requirements for making non-playable characters playable in CTR is that they must already have a model somewhere in that game, and they must also have an asset behavior file, either in CTR or the NST. And I don't think any non-playable characters have those files in CTR, so it'll be the NST. That actually leaves you with quite a small pool of characters to choose from, but it's still bigger than it is in the Insane Trilogy, which is quite surprising considering there's already like 56 characters who are playable in CTR, something like that. But what I have here is a folder of most of the behavior files from the NST, so we can have a look through these and see which of these characters exist somewhere in CTR, because those are the ones we can make playable. And these are from the Switch version of the Insane Trilogy now, because only the files from the Switch version will work with the Switch version of CTR. As you might expect, the bosses folder is mostly characters who are already playable in CTR, although the Embryo Blob, the Engine Mechs, and the Lions from the Crash 3 Tiny Fight do all make cameo appearances in CTR tracks, so you could do this with any of them if you wanted to. There's also the versions of Aku Aku and Uka Uka from the Cortex boss in Crash 3, which I've used before to make those guys playable in CTR. I think making Aku Aku playable is actually my favourite thing that I've done with this game so far, and I can't believe they still haven't done this for real. But this is why I was only able to do it with Aku Aku and Uka Ruka and not Sparks or Apo Apo. They don't have behaviour files. Here's the giant polar bear files, which I used for my Bearminator video. The Triceratops that chases you in the dinosaur levels is here too. That model's in CTR as well, but would probably have similar problems to the bear because of its size. And here's a flytrap plant, like the ones I mentioned earlier from Papu's Pyramid. That is a classic Crash enemy, and could be quite fun to see driving a cart, don't you think? Once you start going through these files, you realise just how much of the stuff that was made for the Insane Trilogy made it into CTR. They were pretty resourceful about that, I think. Here's the Hog, and here's Baby T, who I did also mod into the game before he was added for real. Bear and Tiger are Polar and Pura. There's a bike folder too, because that is technically another rideable character, although it might look better as a replacement for a cart than a driver. Again, I'll come to the carts later. This folder from Crash 3 contains some of the variations of lab assistants that appear in that game. Now, of course, the lab assistants are interesting because one of the new characters that was added in the latest update to CTR was the lab assistant, and a few different versions of him were included as skins. You might think that now that the lab assistant is an official character, it might be possible to just swap his model with one of the other versions of him that appears in the game somewhere as a background character. I know I personally would love to see the Terminator lab assistant as a playable character, and in the Insane Trilogy, a lot of these different types of lab assistants are pretty much completely interchangeable with each other. So I was hoping that it would be the same kind of situation as the caveman version of Fate Crash that appears in Prehistoric Playground, because I was able to turn him into a proper skin and he worked great actually. But the model that is used for the lab assistant as a playable character is slightly different to the model used for the NPC lab assistants you see hanging around on the tracks. I haven't investigated it too closely, but I would imagine that the driver model has been updated to be a bit more expressive. You see a bit more emotion from them as drivers than you do elsewhere. A lot of other characters are more expressive in this game than in the Insane Trilogy, but for the most part that's just about the animations, and the models are basically identical between the two games, which is why the animations from one game work in the other. With this motherfucker, although the model doesn't look like it's changed very much, it's different enough to mean that the animations used for the playable lab assistant do not work properly with the NPC models. So even though the Terminator lab assistant does exist as a background character in a couple of tracks in CTR, if you try to turn that or any of the other background lab assistants into skins for the playable lab assistant, this is what you get. The problem here isn't the textures, I just didn't bother fixing those because this was just a test. And actually, it may not be immediately obvious what is wrong because I turned the camera around so he's facing you here, but his head is all kind of twisted around and there's some other parts of him that are kind of glitchy, and the same thing happens with any of the NPC lab assistants, even the ones that may be turned into official skins in the future, judging by the currently unused podium animations. So it turns out Caveman Fate Crash is the only example of an alternative skin for one of the drivers that actually works properly. I did try to see if I could turn the Eskimo Sharks from Meteor Gorge into a skin for Nash before he got his own Eskimo skin, but that didn't really work either. And a few people have asked me about the vampire costume that Stu had back when the Spooky Grand Prix launched, because it seemed like that might be a similar situation to Caveman Fate Crash. Unfortunately, the CTR TV videos are all pre-rendered, and although for the first couple of Grand Prix they did actually leave the level files for those in the game, I'm back! They had stopped doing that before the Halloween GP started, so no vampire chickens just yet. Maybe by Halloween 2020, if they're still adding stuff to the game by then. But it is still possible to make some of those other lab assistant skins playable through the methods that I used for Aku Aku and the Hog and all that other stuff I've done. So what actually is the process? Well, when I demonstrated how to do this with the NST, there were three main files of importance when it came to swapping character models around, and that's exactly the same with CTR. There's the actor file, which is the model, there's the animation file, and there's the behavior file, which I was talking about earlier. There is also some stuff you need to do with textures, but that's one of the things I meant when I said that if this game does come to PC and other people start messing with it, it will work completely differently to the Switch version. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that stuff, but it does mean that I need to modify the materials archive of whichever character I'm replacing, as well as the archives that contain the actor file and the animations and behavior stuff, which, as I showed you earlier, is all scattered around in different pack files, so that's always fun. And yeah, I should clarify that all the character mods I've done in this game have been replacing existing characters rather than adding new ones. I would say that I do probably know enough about how this game and the engine works to be able to add them in as extra characters instead, with a bit of jiggery pokery, but that's something else that should be a lot easier if and when the game comes to PC, so I'm not going to bother spending ages trying to do it just now. There are a few existing characters that I wouldn't mind replacing with someone else, but because of the need to replace textures, the quickest and easiest way to do this is by picking a character that has a lot of textures already. And also, because of how the update files work, it's easiest to use a character that wasn't in the base game. Because when new skins get added for these original characters, the modified animation files and stuff get added to the update archive, and sometimes the models and textures get tweaked too, so everything ends up in an even bigger mess than it was to begin with, because as well as multiple archives for each character, you need to replace some files in the update archive as well. But with all of the additional characters that have been added since launch, instead of their individual files getting added to the update pack when they're modified, their whole archives just get updated and they remain completely self-contained. So you can pull those out of the update pack, change whatever you want and re-import them without worrying about replacing other stuff in the update file. So what I'm going to do is take one of the lab assistants that exists in the files for CTR but isn't currently available as a skin, and I'm going to use Fake Velo as the character to replace, because that's what I did when I recorded the footage. I know that Twilight Tour has quite a few different types of lab assistants. I make it 5, I think, which includes the Genie lab assistant that you might have noticed earlier has one of those special behavior files from his appearance in the Insane Trilogy. So I'm going to extract his actor file from here, as well as the textures that go with it. Of course, there are some animations for this guy in here too, because he's animated while he flies around Twilight Tour delivering those Wumpa boxes, but generally it's safer to use the animation file that comes from the same place as the behavior file you're using, because those are designed to go together. And also, the Genie's files in Twilight Tour are in this Octane folder. Octane is like the internal code name for CTR Nitro Fueled, so typically, if any stuff from the Insane Trilogy ends up in here, it's probably at least slightly different to the original version. So the behavior file I need is going to be in the Arabian levels from Crash 3. This is Hang 'em High, the Switch version, that's important. In CTR, he was called Lab Carpet, but here he's Lab Genie, which is another indication that something's been changed slightly between the two games. But hopefully it should all still work okay. I mean, I know it definitely will work okay because I actually did this mod like a month ago. But I'm going to grab labgenie.hka and labgenie.hkx, and that's everything I need from here. Already got the model and the textures, now I just need to mix it all together. In the initial release of this game, all of the archives for the characters were given sensible names: Driver Coco, Driver Cortex, Driver Crash, and so on. But later on, they started using code names. BAL is the lab assistant, BCX is Baby Cortex, BTE is the Iron Checkpoint Crate. I don't know why they started doing that. I'm sure they haven't noticed that some people are sneaking around in these files or anything like that. But anyway, Emperor Velo, which is the character I'm looking for, is inexplicably Driver Joe. If you've noticed these other drivers that seem to just be a single archive without all the extra files for skins and materials and stuff, these are actually the drivers you're competing against when you're trying to beat the Beanox developer times that were added in the last update. Because of the way the time trial ghost system works, they needed to be added into the game as new, separate, non-playable characters, and they just share their model files and stuff with the characters they're racing as. But you can turn them into playable characters if you really want to. Anyway, I can just import the Genie's animation and behavior files straight into this main Velo archive. And the textures too. can go straight into Driver Joe default materials. The actor file contains references to some material files, which in turn tell it which textures to load, and this all comes under the category of stuff that wouldn't matter if the game was on PC, but I am going to have to change the names of the materials inside the actor file to match the materials for Velo that correspond to the textures I replaced. There's quite a few different ways to go about getting textures to work properly. This one admittedly is probably the worst and doesn't give you perfect results, but it's quick and simple, so it's what I normally do. The other thing I need to do is grab this other kind of behavior file from the Driver Joe archive, an HKB file this time, which is basically a list of every action that the character can do and which animation should be used for each of those actions. If you're importing a character that has a lot of animations, you can be a bit more creative here, but most enemies and NPCs and stuff are pretty basic in that respect, so I'll generally just set everything to the idle animation, or if there's some kind of sitting down animation, that's always good for driving. Conveniently, the Genie lab assistant is always sitting down on his magic carpet, so his standard idle animation should be fine. Just need to remember to import all of those modified archives back into update.pack and then see how it looks in-game. So here's the normal lab assistant for comparison, and if I switch over to Emperor Bello 27, boom, Genie floating on his magic carpet driving a go-kart. Perfect. Isn't he magnificent? I didn't bother changing the icon or the name or anything, but that's all possible if you want to do it. Obviously, the carpet makes this guy a bit different, and that might be a problem, but I do have a couple of ideas for things to make that a bit better. If you pick one of the hovering carts, you can actually hide the carpet completely. Kind of just makes it look like he's gone for an upgrade, which I think is pretty cool. Or it would be easy enough to remove the carpet altogether. But how about this as an alternative? Just let him use his flying carpet as his cart. I mean, he comes with a vehicle already, right? This is definitely my personal preference. I bet, even if they do add the Genie as a lab assistant skin in the future, it's not going to look quite like this. I'm not too sure about the way the fire comes out the back like this, but that's all stuff you can change or disable if you want. And as well as the icon and the name being wrong, there's also all the sounds and voice lines for the characters which you might also want to modify. I'll admit that with my Aku Aku Uka Uka video, I did just add all that dialogue when editing the video, instead of actually converting it and importing it into the game.
Punch him in the throat.
Although that is possible to do. Really, in the case of the Genie, you could just recycle all the normal lab assistants voice clips. I think that would be fine. You could also come up with some exotic skins for your custom characters, because it's more than likely the ones that were made for the character you've replaced are not going to look pretty on a different model. As for the legendary skins, well, I don't think it's a pirate's life for this guy. Maybe I should try using the Terminator lab assistant as a legendary skin for the Genie instead of for the normal lab assistant like I did earlier. Anyway, just because this particular example turned out alright doesn't mean it always works this well. One of the other potential custom characters I mentioned earlier when going through all the behavior files was the flytrap plant. Now, the version of the plant that has a behavior file is the one that spits at you in the digging levels in Crash 2. If you test the spitting plant's animations with the flytrap model that's in Papu's pyramid, it looks like it should be compatible. But when you go through the whole process of modding it into the game like I did with the Genie, this is what you actually get. The head looks great, but the leaves and the stem are all kind of fucked up and horrible. And this has happened with a few of the characters I've tried to do this with before. I haven't spent a lot of time looking into this stuff, and I don't really know anything about 3D models. And my experience with animation is more like than any 3D stuff. I believe this might be an issue with how the character connects to the cart that doesn't always play right with certain models, but the same thing does happen even on the podium, so I'm not totally sure. Fixing this may be as simple as renaming some of the bones of the plant model, but I haven't had much chance to experiment yet, what with all the other commitments I have with these games at the moment. I think this issue is also related to the main problem I've had with custom carts, which is that, well, this tends to happen. It is entirely possible to swap the models for carts around. It works in exactly the same way as it does with the drivers, except the carts each just have one single archive instead of like the 20 that most of the drivers do. But it's the same process. You need the actor file, the animations, the behaviors, and the textures. Anything you can use for a custom character, you can also use for a custom kart, as long as you don't mind it looking like this. You can even do both at the same time if you really want to. The custom kart that people ask me about the most is Crash's motorbike, and it does fit the requirements. Its model appears in CTR in Dingo Canyon, and it does have a behaviour file in the Insane Trilogy, as do all of the vehicles and characters you can ride in that game. So it is at least possible to do this. Of course, this isn't ideal, but it does do this cool thing with the wheel trails if you pick wheels that have that kind of effect. So that's nice. I think it would be awesome if they added the bike as a real kart at some point. The obvious argument against doing that is that they would have to create a whole new set of animations for every single character, but I have seen people suggest that they could just make it exclusive to Crash, which I would happily take as a compromise, because I don't enjoy the motorbike levels very much in Crash 3, but as a concept, I think the motorbike is pretty awesome. I haven't been able to try Crash's actual bike riding animations from the Insane Trilogy in this game to see if those would get him sat the right way up, and I haven't been able to try his hog riding animations with the hog cart either, because I haven't been able to get Crash's animations from the NST to work in CTR at all. As I've shown a few times, the animation files are compatible between the two games, and you can use Crash's CTR animations in the NST. But in my experience, if you try to use Crash's NST animations in CTR, or Coco's too for that matter, the game will just crash. I'm guessing that those animation files might just be a bit too big and complex for CTR to handle, considering that game generally has a lot more big and complex files loaded at any given time than the Insane Trilogy ever does. Maybe that's something else that might work better on a PC version. Maybe one day we'll find out. But if I figure out how to make custom karts work a bit nicer, I will let you know. And if a PC release does happen at some point, I'll be sure to revisit all of this stuff and give some information that's a bit more relevant to that version, because none of this is going to apply at all. And if that doesn't ever happen, I hope this at least answered some of the questions you might have had about how these character mods work, or maybe being an interesting look at the similarities and differences between CTR Nitro Fueled and the Insane Trilogy. Or if nothing else, just a way to pass some time while you're stuck in quarantine. There are some other things about this game that I would like to talk about. I am still working on that level editor, and since Nitro Fueled and the Insane Trilogy are both built with the same engine and use the same kind of files, there is some CTR compatibility in the level editor already, and there is some potential for custom tracks in the future. Maybe not quite to the same extent that custom levels are possible in the Insane Trilogy because of the limitations of the Switch version of CTR, but it's definitely something I'm interested in exploring a bit more. So maybe I'll look at that next time, and until then, stay at home and don't fucking breathe on anyone.